Number 1.
Francis was last seen in Santa Ana, California on April 9, 1979. He had gone to work that day with his father, Dennis, who delivered water tanks to businesses and private homes. After Dennis finished work, he left Charles at the corner of Chestnut Avenue and Lyon Street while he went to unload his truck. He didn't want his boss to find out he'd taken Charles along with him because children were not allowed to ride in the trucks. Dennis told his son to walk to an address in the 300 block of South Lyon Street and wait to be picked up. When Dennis went to the designated location 10 minutes later, Charles was gone. His father searched the neighborhood for half an hour, then notified the police. Charles's parents were fighting over custody of him at the time of his disappearance. His mother had legal custody, but he had lived with Dennis for most of his life. He and his father had traveled from Colorado to California 3 weeks beforehand in order for Dennis to attend a custody hearing scheduled for April 26. Authorities looked into the possibility that one of the child's parents was hiding him, but found no evidence to support this theory. Convicted child killer James Crummell is the prime suspect in Charles's disappearance, as well as in the 1995 disappearance of 9-year-old Jack Phillips from Big Bear Lake, California. He was a violent serial sexual abuser, a record of child molestation dating back to the 1960s. All but one of his known victims were boys in roughly the same age group as Charles and Jack. A photo of Crummell is posted with this case summary. In August 1967, he abducted a 14-year-old Wisconsin boy, molested him and beat him almost to death. He served 5 years of a 30-year sentence for the crime. In 1983, he was convicted of the February 1967 murder of an Arizona boy and sentenced to life in prison, but the conviction was overturned in 1987 because of ineffective counsel. He ended up pleading guilty to kidnapping in the Arizona case and was released later that year. In 1997, Crummell was charged with the murder of a 13-year-old neighbor boy, James Wilfred Jamie Trotter. Jamie disappeared in 1979. In 1990, Crummell discovered the teen's skull, but it wasn't identified until 1996. After his murder arrest, investigators approached Crummell about Jack's case, and he offered to confess to Jack's murder if prosecutors would not seek the death penalty for the Trotter murder. The deal was turned down, and Crummell was convicted of Jamie Trotter's murder in 2004 and sentenced to death. In June 2012, he committed suicide on death row by hanging himself with an electric cord. He didn't leave a note. Charles is missing under suspicious circumstances, and investigators believe he may have met with foul play. His case remains unsolved.
Number 2.
Barbara was last seen at her apartment in the 1000 block of Alice Street in Zanesville, Ohio on January 30, 1985. After she came home from work, her ex-husband, Jeff Frame, came over and said she had go see her divorce attorney immediately and sign papers. Their divorce had been finalized just 6 weeks earlier. Barbara told her 3 children she would go to the meeting, buy groceries, visit her mother in the hospital, and then talk to her landlord about some damage to their apartment. Then she would come home and cook dinner. She left home at 5 p.m. She never returned, and it turned out she did not really have an appointment at her attorney's office. She has never been heard from again. The day after her disappearance, her car was found abandoned in the back of the parking lot on Linden Avenue. This was across the street from United Technologies, the company where she worked, but the car wasn't parked where she would have normally parked it. Prior to her disappearance, she had gone 5 years at work without a single absence. According to Barbara and Jeff's daughter, Jeff was physically abusive towards Barbara and had threatened her life more than once. He lived within eyesight of her new apartment, and even after their divorce was final, he would come over every day and try to convince her to return to him. Their daughter described his behavior as stalking. After Barbara's disappearance, Jeff stopped coming to her home and instead began harassing her family members. He took 2 polygraph tests about Barbara's disappearance, but the results for both were inconclusive. Someone later reported that Jeff had come to him to ask for drugs that would interfere with the polygraph results. After Barbara went missing, Jeff was in trouble with the law numerous times and spent time in prison. Barbara's loved ones don't believe she would have left without warning, and they described her as a devoted mother who took good care of her children and wouldn't have abandoned them. Her mother was dying of cancer at the time of her disappearance. Her case remains unsolved.
Number 3.
Kenneth disappeared with his family. His wife Barbara and 3 daughters, Barbie, Susan, 13, and Virginia, 11. The Martins disappeared from their hometown of Portland, Oregon on December 7, 1958. They lived in the 1700 block of Northeast 57th Avenue. They set off that day in their 9-passenger cream and red 1954 Ford station wagon with the license plate number 1G7156 en route for Columbia Gorge, where they planned to collect greenery to decorate their home for Christmas. They bought gasoline at Cascade Locks late that afternoon. They were seen leaving a restaurant in Hood River, Oregon late in the afternoon on the way back to Portland. Kenneth was carrying 2 cameras. The Martins never arrived home. Everything was left undisturbed at their residence. The previous meal's dishes were draining in the sink, there was a load of wash in the washing machine, and Kenneth's Santa Claus suit was still laid out from a Christmas party he'd been to the night before. They also left a substantial amount of money behind in the family bank accounts. In February 1959, a searcher discovered tire tracks matching the Martins' vehicle heading off a cliff into the Columbia River near the Dalles, Oregon. In May of that year, a river drilling rig near the site of the tire tracks hooked something heavy and metal on its anchor. Before the object could be pulled to the surface, it came loose. It may have been the missing Ford. A couple of days later, Susan and Virginia's bodies were found downstream near Bonneville Dam. They had both drowned. Photos of the 2 girls are posted with this case summary. The cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition, but Virginia's body had a hole in the head. Kenneth, Barbara and Barbie's remains have never been recovered. Police believe all the Martins either perished after they accidentally drove their car into the river, or possibly they were abducted and were inside their car as it was pushed off the cliff. The only surviving member of the family was the oldest son, Donald, who was in the Navy and stationed in New York at the time of the disappearances. A photo of Donald is posted with this case summary. Walter Graven, the Multnomah County detective in charge of investigating the Martin case, believed the family met with foul play. It would have been uncharacteristic of Kenneth to leave home at that time of day, as he didn't like driving after dark. Someone found a blood-stained gun in the Cascade Locks near an abandoned stolen car and turned the gun over to the sheriff's office. The gun was later linked to Donald. He had allegedly stolen it from a sporting goods store several years prior to his family's disappearance. It was never processed for evidence, however. Graven suspected Donald was involved in his family's disappearance as he couldn't find anyone else who had motive. Donald had a poor relationship with his family and he didn't come back to Oregon during the search for them, although he did speak Graven over the phone. He didn't attend the memorial service for his family, although he did return to Oregon in June 1959 to settle the estate. He told Graven he couldn't think of anyone who had any reason to hurt his family, but that he also couldn't see how it could have been an accident. An attempt was made to search the water for additional evidence, but the search was called off when a diver nearly died. No further searches were made and the case was closed. Graven died in 1988 and Donald died in 2003. Kenneth, Barbara and Barbie remain missing.
Number 4.
Miller was dropped off at a bar in Milton, Pennsylvania during the morning hours of July 1, 1989. She was planning to attend the wedding of a friend later in the day and was carrying a gift, as well as her clothes for the event. She apparently attended the ceremony and was photographed there, though some accounts state that she never arrived at the wedding. Miller is believed to have returned to her home in Sunbury, Pennsylvania during the early morning hours of July 2. She resided on Penn Street with a former Sunbury police detective, Joseph Walter Mike Egan, who reported her missing. She has never been heard from again. Prior to Miller's disappearance, she was a police informant and provided authorities with information about drug trafficking. She had received threatening letters from people who warned her to stop talking to authorities or she would be killed. About 2 weeks before Miller went missing, she told investigators that the matter had been taken care of and asked them to give back the letters she'd passed on to them. It is unclear whether Miller's work as an informant or the death threats were related to her later disappearance. Egan served time in state prison after Miller's disappearance, convicted of extortion. He initially cooperated with the authorities investigating Miller's case, but later refused to meet with them. She had filed complaints with the police about Egan and told friends she was afraid he would kill her. Investigators have identified him as the lead suspect in her case. Miller left behind a 13-year-old son. Authorities searched several mines in Augusta Township, Pennsylvania during the years following her disappearance and searched a pond near Trevorton, Pennsylvania in 2004. She is believed to be the victim of a homicide. She was declared legally dead in the fall of 2002. Some agencies may list July 2, 1989, as the date of Miller's disappearance, which remains unsolved.
Number 5.
Kevin was last seen at approximately 6:40 p.m. on February 10, 1984, in his hometown of San Francisco, California. He was last seen sitting on a bench at a bus stop on the corner of Oak Street and Masonic Avenue, waiting for a bus to take him home from basketball practice. He was witnessed talking at the bus stop to a blond man about 6 feet tall, in his 20s or 30s. The man was accompanied by a large black dog, possibly a Great Dane or similar breed. He has never been heard from again. It is possible that Kevin was abducted by two Caucasian men driving a four-door royal blue 1967 Ford Galaxy, but that report has never been confirmed. The Northern California child killer John Dunkel is possible suspect in his case. His three known victims physically resembled Kevin and were in roughly the same age group. Dunkel has never been charged in connection with Kevin's case, however. Dan Leonard Therrien was questioned as a possible suspect in Kevin's disappearance in 1984, and police searched his apartment with his permission. He used several alias dates of birth and alias names, including Raymond William Stewart, Kelly Lee Dawson, and Kelly Sean Stewart, and the San Francisco police knew him as Wayne D. Jackson. He lived across the street from Kevin's school, had a history of sex crimes against children. He resembled the man with the dog that was seen talking to Kevin before his disappearance, and he owned a large black Doberman dog. Photographs of Therrien are posted with this case summary. Two witnesses at the time failed to pick him out of a lineup, the search of his home yielded nothing, and he was released. Unbeknownst to the San Francisco police, at the time they questioned him, Therrien was wanted for kidnapping and sexually assaulting two 13-year-old boys. He had been arrested for the crime, but skipped bail and fled the country before the case was resolved. Therrien was still in San Francisco and was living under an alias name when he died of natural causes in 2008. In early 2013, authorities renewed the investigation and searched his former residence again. They found some bones under the apartment building's garage, but believe they are animal bones. Kevin was in the 4th grade at St. Agnes School when he disappeared. He the sixth of 10 children in an Irish Catholic family and resided in the 2500 block of Sutter Street in San Francisco. His siblings ranged in age from 7 to 19 years old in 1984. One cousin and one foster child were also living in the Collins residence. Authorities do not believe Kevin ran away from home, as he got along well with his family and was not having any problems except for being bullied at school. His parents divorced amicably after his disappearance. In 1994, they held a memorial service for him. His father founded a missing children's organization, the Kevin Collins Foundation, but it closed in 1996 due to financial constraints. Kevin's case remains unsolved. His mother still lives in the local area, but his father has since moved out of the United States. His case remains unsolved.
Number 6.
Morrison was last seen in Hammond, Indiana on December 1, 1979. He was the son of a wealthy local businessman and was well known in the local music scene. He owned a high-end stereo store, Stereo Components Incorporated, in the 700 block of Seberger Lane, just west of Calumet Avenue in Munster, Indiana. In the early morning hours of December 1, the police were called to the store to investigate a white car parked out front with 4 men inside it. The vehicle was gone by the time authorities arrived. The store's door was unlocked and the cash register was open, and there was a bloodstain on the doorframe. A set of keys on Morrison's desk was also bloodstained. The store's burglar alarm had been turned off, and there was no sign of forced entry. A friend went to Morrison's apartment in the 7100 block of Meadow Lane in Hammond to check on him. The apartment had been ransacked and there was evidence of a violent struggle, and including bloodstains in the basement and on the ground floor, and there was a snow shovel caked with blood and hair. Some expensive stereo components and photography equipment lay undisturbed inside the residence. Morrison and his vehicle, a white 1974 Pontiac Grand Am with vanity license plates reading stereo, was missing. Before sunrise that day, someone reported seeing a body floating in shallow water in Lake Michigan, just a few feet off an isolated stretch of beach on the north side of the city. The body was of a white male, wearing only a shirt and socks, and he appeared to have been badly beaten. On the beach was a blood-stained length of metal pipe. Rather than wading into the water and pulling the body ashore themselves, the police who responded to the scene stood and watched it in the water while they waited for the arrival of additional officers with a rope and body recovery hook. Within half an hour, before the other officers arrived, the wind and waves had pushed the body further out into the lake, and it was gone. There was subsequently an internal investigation into the police officers' actions or lack thereof. One officer was cleared of misconduct, but 2 others were found guilty dereliction of duty. One was suspended for 5 days, and one was suspended for 10 days. 3 days later, Morrison's car was found in the vicinity of South 161st Place in South Holland, Illinois. Witnesses said it had been there since early on December 2. There was blood smeared on the backseat, the floor and the outside of the passenger door, and Morrison's driver's license was on the front seat. There was no other sign of him. At the time of his disappearance, Morrison had warrants out for his arrest. He had failed to appear in court to answer lawsuits filed by bill collectors. His case is considered a kidnapping and homicide, and police looked into several persons of interest, but no suspects have been named in his case. It remains unsolved.
Number 7.
Like many small-town girls in America, 19-year-old Morgan Bauer dreamed of life in the big city. In 2016, that dream became a reality when she packed her bags and headed to Atlanta. Less than 2 weeks later, she had vanished into thin air. After leaving her home in Aberdeen, South Dakota, Morgan caught a flight from Minneapolis and landed in Atlanta on February 12, 2016. Morgan arrived with little to her name. She was waiting for her tax return to be loaded onto a card, and until that happened she had very limited funds. She had told her mother, Sherry, that she was moving with 2 roommates, perhaps to avoid the concern that her real plans would have invited. With no money for rent, she had arranged to stay with people she had met on Craigslist in return for cleaning their house. At first the plan seemed to be working well, and the trio even enjoyed a meal out at a restaurant on the night Morgan had arrived. But the next day she returned home to find her belongings outside and a note telling her not to come back. Dependent on others for transport and shelter, her whereabouts over the next few days are not known for certain, although it appears that she was drifting between motels in the area. It wasn't long before the money ran out and Morgan started dancing at the now-defunct strip club Top of Gainesville. She was also hired at another venue, Club Tease, but as she did not have the necessary permit she never actually worked a shift. Morgan was an avid user of social media and had updating her friends regularly since leaving South Dakota. But after February 25 her posts suddenly stopped. After a couple of weeks her best friend Aryn got in touch with Sherry to let her know she hadn't heard from Morgan. Sherry hadn't noticed anything unusual up until then. Her daughter hadn't been speaking at the time after a disagreement about some documents Morgan needed before she moved. Sherry reported her missing and a police investigation was launched. Morgan's last known contact was on the early hours of February 26 after she finished her shift at the Top of Gainesville. She had left the club that night with another dancer and her boyfriend, though it is not clear what the 3 of them did after they left. When Morgan's phone was traced, police discovered it had last pinged just after midnight in the couple's town of Porterdale. Her phone has never been found, and there has been no activity from it ever since. The couple claimed to have dropped her off at Citgo gas station just a few miles away, but on other occasions denied ever seeing Morgan at all. Despite this, the man and woman have never been thoroughly investigated. They have since split up and now live in different states. It wasn't long before Morgan's case gained traction in the national media, her story and her face an increasingly familiar fixture on news sites and forums across the web. But with this increased awareness came negative attention that would have a catastrophic effect on the investigation. Some of this attention came from a most unlikely source, Morgan's very own sister, Alyssa. Alyssa had been using Facebook and Reddit to spread the word about Morgan's disappearance, but her posts took a drastic turn 1 month after she went missing. Alyssa announced that not only was her sister alive and well, but that Sherry knew she was too. She claimed that Morgan had left South Dakota to get away from their manipulative, bipolar mother, and that Sherry had spoken to Morgan since she moved to Atlanta. She also alleged that Sherry had publicized her disappearance for attention and monetary gain after setting up a GoFundMe to aid the investigation. Morgan's best friend Aryn, who had originally told Sherry that Morgan was missing, also posted on a Facebook group that she believed she had been talking to Morgan online. With that, more and more people began to question whether Morgan was missing at all, despite her inclusion on the NamUs and NCMEC databases, as well as an active police investigation. But why would Morgan need to disappear to get away from her mother? Legally she was an adult and was in no way obligated to stay in touch with Sherry, who she hadn't even been living with prior to her move. Morgan had also been due in for a shift at work on the evening of the 26th, though she never turned up nor got in touch to let them know. It seems unlikely that someone who used their phone and social media accounts as often as Morgan did would use both during her first 2 weeks in Atlanta before ditching both, never to be used again. It is just as unlikely that someone so short of cash would leave a $630 tax return untouched in their account. Morgan has now been missing for over 2.5 years, and in that time police have made few developments in the case. Thanks to internet rumors and widespread gossip, some people don't realize that Morgan hasn't been found. Some are convinced she was never even missing.